For most people, darkness was a time for rest. But for Special Agent Ethan Monroe, it was when the hunt truly began. Over the years, Monroe had learned that evil rarely showed its face in the light of day. It lurked in the dark corners of the world, waiting for the right moment to strike. And for every monster that stalked the night, there had to be someone willing to chase it. Monroe had been with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, for more than 15 years. He had seen more death than most could stomach, but every case left its mark. This latest one, though, it felt different. It wasn't just the number of victims. It was the way the killer operated, as if he were toying with them, daring them to find him. And now, with the body count rising, Monroe knew they were running out of time. The call came in at 3 a.m. A jogger had found the body of a young woman deep in the woods just outside Portland. Monroe arrived at the scene before dawn, the chill of the early morning air biting at his skin. He had seen this too many times before. A lifeless body discarded like trash, left for someone else to find. The victim was Emily Richards, 19 years old. She had been missing for 3 weeks. Monroe crouched beside the body, his gloved hand gently lifting a strand of the victim's hair. There were no obvious signs of violence, no ligature marks, no defensive wounds, just like the others. "She's the fourth one in 6 months," said Detective Sam Hayes, a local officer who had been assigned to the case. Monroe nodded, standing up and scanning the area. The killer had left no clues, just like before. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air after each murder. But Monroe knew better. This killer wanted to be found. He was just waiting for the right time. Back at the BAU headquarters, Monroe and his team worked tirelessly to piece together the killer's profile. Each victim had been a young woman, between the ages of 18 and 25. They had all been abducted from their homes or while walking alone at night. Each body had been found in a different location, but the method was always the same. No physical signs of trauma, no evidence left behind. "He's meticulous," said Agent Caroline Foster, Monroe's partner and one of the best behavioral profilers in the unit. "He's not killing out of rage. It's about control for him." Monroe agreed. Whoever the killer was, he was playing a long game. He had no interest in getting caught. Not yet, at least. But the more Monroe studied the pattern, the more it began to disturb him. This killer wasn't just careful, he was obsessed with perfection. Every detail of the crime scenes had been methodically planned, down to the precise positioning of the bodies. "He wants us to admire his work," Monroe muttered, staring at the photos of the victims. "Which means he'll escalate," Foster replied, her voice tight. "It's only a matter of time." Monroe wasn't one for attending memorial services, but something about this case kept pulling him back. Emily Richards' parents stood at the front of the small chapel, their faces pale and hollow. They had been living in a nightmare for the past 3 weeks, and now, their worst fears had been confirmed. Monroe stood at the back, watching in silence. These moments were always the hardest, the raw grief of families torn apart by senseless violence. But it was also a reminder of why he did this job. He owed it to them to catch the man who had taken their daughter. After the service, Monroe approached the family, offering his condolences. It was a formality, but it was all he could give them. "We're going to find him," Monroe said softly. "I promise you that." Back at the office, the pressure was mounting. The media had caught wind of the story, and reporters were hounding the FBI for updates. Monroe could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on him. They were running out of time, and the killer was still out there, waiting for his next victim. But there was something else bothering Monroe. The killer had left no clues, no trace of his presence at the crime scenes. It was almost as if he wanted to remain invisible. But why? Monroe's instincts told him there was something they were missing, some piece of the puzzle that hadn't fallen into place yet. "He's watching us?" Monroe muttered, glancing at the photos of the crime scenes. "He knows we're getting close." The breakthrough came when Monroe's team discovered a connection between the victims, a small detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. All of the women had visited the same bar in the weeks leading up to their abductions. It was a quiet place, tucked away on the edge of town, frequented mostly by locals. Monroe visited the bar, questioning the staff and regulars. No one had seen anything suspicious, but there was something about the place that felt wrong. It wasn't the bar itself, it was the people who came there. They were a tight-knit group, and Monroe could sense that they knew more than they were letting on. As Monroe dug deeper, he began to unravel a dark web of secrets that connected the bar to the victims. There was someone in the shadows, someone who had been watching these women long before they became victims. Monroe stared at the footage. The grainy black and white video showed a silhouette moving just outside the victim's home, lurking in the shadows. It was too dark to make out any details, but one thing was clear: the figure wasn't supposed to be there. He had stayed long enough to be seen, but not long enough to leave any trace of himself. "This guy knows what he's doing," Monroe muttered. "He's careful." Agent Caroline Foster, Monroe's trusted partner, sat across from him, reviewing the stills. "If this is our guy, he's not going to give us much to work with. He's too smart." Monroe nodded. The killer had proven himself meticulous, leaving no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. But this was the first time they had something resembling a clue, even if it was nothing more than a shadow. "He's been watching them for weeks, maybe months," Foster added. "He knows their routines, where they feel safe. He's patient. He's not rushing into this." Monroe leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied the figure. "And he's not going to stop." For the next few days, Monroe and his team scoured the neighborhood where the latest victim, Emily Richards, had lived. They interviewed neighbors, looked at security footage from other homes, and tracked down anyone who might have seen something. They hit dead end after dead end. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had noticed a stranger lurking around. It was as if the killer was invisible, a ghost who could slip in and out of the quiet suburban life without a trace. But Monroe refused to give up. One afternoon, while canvassing the neighborhood for a second time, Monroe found himself speaking to Mrs. Duncan, an elderly widow who lived a few doors down from Emily Richards. She hesitated as Monroe asked his questions, her hands trembling slightly. "Now that you mention it," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did see someone. It was late, maybe a week or two before that poor girl disappeared. I thought it was one of those teenagers sneaking around, but now I'm not so sure." Monroe felt a spark of hope. "Did you see his face?" Mrs. Duncan shook her head. "No, but he was tall, slender, dressed all in black. He stood across the street for a few minutes. Then he just disappeared." Monroe scribbled notes furiously, his mind racing. "Did you notice anything else about him?" "Just the way he moved," she whispered. "It gave me chills, like he was hunting." As Monroe returned to headquarters, he couldn't shake the unease Mrs. Duncan's description had left him with. The killer was methodical, stalking his prey as if they were part of a grand plan. He wasn't just picking random victims, he was selecting them, learning everything he could before striking. But why? Why these particular women? Monroe reviewed the case files again and again, searching for a connection that wasn't immediately obvious. "Look at their backgrounds," Foster suggested one late evening as they sat alone in the office. "There has to be something that ties them together. Maybe they went to the same school, worked at the same place, had the same doctor. Something." Monroe nodded, flipping through the files. Each victim had been young, between the ages of 18 and 25, but their lives didn't intersect in any clear way. They hadn't grown up in the same towns, didn't work in the same industries, and had no shared social circles. "Maybe the connection isn't obvious," Monroe said, his voice low. "Maybe it's something deeper." Then came the call Monroe had been waiting for, but not in the way he expected. Another body had been found, this time in an old warehouse that had been abandoned for years. The police had been called after a vagrant stumbled upon the gruesome scene. Monroe arrived to find the building cordoned off with police tape, the stench of decay hanging heavy in the air. This time, the victim was different. A woman in her early 30s, out of the killer's usual age range. Monroe knelt beside the body, his gut churning. The killer had posed her just as he had the others, but there was something new, something more sinister about this scene. On the floor beside the victim was a message, scrawled in what appeared to be her own blood. "You're getting closer. This is different," Foster whispered, her face pale as she stood next to him. "He's taunting us." Monroe's jaw tightened. "He's changing the rules of the game." The new murder threw the investigation into chaos. The killer had broken his pattern, and now Monroe had to start considering possibilities he hadn't before. Was it a copycat? Or had the killer simply grown bolder? In the days that followed, Monroe's team finally caught a break. A suspect, a man named Gregory Lane, was picked up in connection with the warehouse murder. Lane had a long history of mental illness and a record of stalking young women. He was exactly the kind of person Monroe had been looking for. But something didn't sit right with Monroe. Lane fit the profile, but there was something off about him. He seemed too predictable, too obvious. Monroe had dealt with killers like Lane before, and they didn't have the sophistication of the man he was hunting. "He's not our guy," Monroe said after hours of interrogating Lane. "He's a creep, but he's not smart enough to pull this off." Foster glanced at Monroe, her brow furrowed. "If he's not the killer, then what's he doing here? How does he know so much?" Monroe shook his head. "Maybe he's been watching the news. Maybe he's copying the real killer. But there's no way he's the one behind this." As Lane sat in custody, Monroe's thoughts returned to the real killer. He was still out there, and the message at the warehouse haunted Monroe's every waking moment. "You're getting closer." But closer to what? Monroe began to revisit every detail of the case, retracing his steps, going over the surveillance footage again and again. And then he saw it, something he had missed the first time. A car, parked just down the street from one of the victims' homes, a few days before her abduction. It had been there in the background of several clips, always in the same spot. He ran the plates, and within minutes, his computer pinged back with a name. Matthew Klein, a former private investigator who had been operating under the radar for years. Monroe's blood ran cold. He knew that name. Monroe's heart raced as he and his team closed in on Klein's location, a remote cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness. Everything had led to this moment. The man who had been playing with them for months was finally within reach. But as Monroe approached the cabin, he felt a sinking feeling in his gut. It was too quiet, too still. Inside, the cabin was empty, except for a single letter addressed to him. "You're here, Agent Monroe. But so am I." Monroe's pulse quickened. The killer hadn't just been watching the victims, he had been watching him. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. The killer had slipped through their fingers again, leaving behind only a taunting message. Monroe knew this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. As he stared out of his office window into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real hunt was just beginning.